for the webinar on children and youth exposure to intimate partner violence in Manitoba, which will be recorded. My name is Dr. Carly Sapoznik-Evans, and I'm the Manager of Research and Quality Assurance at the Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth, known as MACY, and I will be the host for today. The Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth is an independent, nonpartisan office of the Manitoba Legislative Assembly. We represent the rights, interests, and viewpoints of children, youth, and young adults throughout Manitoba who are receiving or should be receiving provincial public services. We do this by providing direct advocacy support to young people and their families, by reviewing public service delivery after the death of a child, and by conducting child-centered research regarding the effectiveness of public services in Manitoba. The Manitoba Advocate is empowered by legislation to make recommendations to improve the effectiveness and responsiveness of services provided to children, youth, and young adults. We are mandated through the Advocate for Children and Youth Act, guided by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and we act according to the best interests of children and youth. I now invite Knowledge Keeper, Cheryl Alexander, to start us off in a good way with a prayer.
Good afternoon. Miigwech ni mashumas, miigwech nokamas, gi basaway aziang nom gom. Miigwech nakit nom gom. Gi miziang mino pamataziwan. Miigwech nakit nom gom, gi miziang nesawin. Miigwech geshki mikwe, oji miziang matiazowin. Oji miziang nabish. Oji miziang, wishiag, beshiag, amudagek, minawa, nabishing ayakik. Miigwech wabanong, jawanong, eshpamuk, minawa ke wittanong. Miigwech gizi manitou.
Thank you very much, Miigwech Cheryl. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the mandate of our office extends across the province that is now called Manitoba. As an office, we therefore live and work on the original lands of the Anishinaabeg, Anishinaabe, Ewok, Dakota Oyate, Denisulin, and Nehe Towuk. And that part of Manitoba is located on the beautiful homeland of the Red River Métis. Many of us at our office, including myself, are guests on this land, and we strive every day to dedicate ourselves and the public resources we are given to making meaningful contributions to the lives of all children and youth, but especially to the lives and experiences of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit youth in our province. We do this by listening to the voices and opinions of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit young people in our work, by ensuring our staff team reflects the diversity of identities and families we serve, by consulting with community members outside of our office, by working in collaboration with the diversity of Indigenous peoples who live here, and overall, by ensuring our office embraces and our work reflects a philosophy of continual learning and a growing in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We have recently released a framework and work plan for reconciliation, which you can find on our website and that you can now see in the chat. It's a document that we have released as part of our commitment and statement of organizational accountability. And we invite anyone to provide feedback to our office about what it describes and contains. You can either send us an email with your thoughts, or we invite you to check out the link in the chat around the Reconciliation Feedback Survey, which is on our website. A little bit of housekeeping now before we get started. To make sure that everyone's Zoom webinar functions are working properly, we will start off with a couple of quick and easy poll questions, which ask about your role in the community and how you heard about today's webinar. So I invite you now to please take a minute to respond to the 2 poll questions so that we can get a sense of who is attending this afternoon's webinar. Great, so I think we're going to close the 2 polls shortly here. And it looks like half of you are service providers, and approximately 13% are public officials, and then other for the other 38%. So welcome everyone. And then in terms of how you heard about us, it looks like through work and email, we're the top two at 44% each, followed by social media and word of mouth at 6% each. So thank you everyone again for filling out the polls. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. I'll then bring them up when we have time for Q&A at the end. We also encourage everyone to fill out an evaluation after the webinar. We'll be sending MACY certificates of completion to all those who attended today and are able to fill out the evaluation. Lastly, please listen, be present, and respect confidentiality if there are people other than us presenters sharing sensitive information. We're here to grow and learn together. I'm now going to turn things over to my colleagues at MACY, who will be leading our conversation about children and youth exposure to intimate partner violence in Manitoba. First up is Dr. Matt Mahar, who has been a researcher at MACY since 2019. Before that, he worked as a researcher at the Canadian Centre for Child Protection. Matt was the lead researcher for the report you will hear about today. Matt will be joined today by Charlene Musica and Ali Raza Alidina. Charlene has been a researcher at MACY since 2019. She has a Master's of Science in Community Health Sciences from the University of Manitoba and expertise in research, evaluation, and quality assurance. Ali Raza Alidina is also a researcher at MACY. He has a bachelor's degree in international development studies from York University and a master's in development practice in Indigenous development from the University of Winnipeg. Take it away, Matt.
Thank you, Carly. Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. The purpose of today's webinar is to present some of the main findings from the report released last week by the Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth titled Every 2 Hours, a special report on children and youth exposed to intimate partner violence in Manitoba. Although the study and the special report were undertaken in fulfillment of the Advocate's legislative responsibilities under the Advocate for Children and Youth Act, it would not be possible without the support and collaboration of multiple stakeholders. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the elders, community members, youth, and service providers who contributed to the special report. Young adults who witnessed intimate partner violence in their childhoods shared their painful truths with us. Our Youth Ambassador Advisory Squad, also known as YAS, also provided their feedback. We thank them for their generosity, courage, and strength. Their shared purpose and hope for this special report is that services can be improved for future generations. Before we dive in, I just wanted to say a word about the cover art that you see here and presented throughout the slides, which features a stylized illustration of prairie crocus flowers. This resilient plant survives the harshest winter conditions, and its flowers are one of the first to emerge in the spring, bringing hope that warmer, brighter days are ahead. Their fuzzy covering shields the stems, buds, and leaves, and they grow low and close together for protection from the wind. The prairie crocus is a blessing that demonstrates life will go on, and its fitting symbolism mirrors the fortitude of the children and youth who witness intimate partner violence. So I'd like to begin with a story told to us by AJ, not his real name, one of the young adults who shared their stories with us. AJ is an Indigenous man in his early 20s. During his interview, he described numerous exposures to intimate partner violence, or IPV, during his childhood between his mother and her partner as a major cause of his involvement with child welfare and the mental health challenges he experienced later as a teenager. AJ was about 5 years old when he first remembers witnessing IPV, though he didn't know what IPV meant at the time or that it was wrong. His mother's partner would yell and physically hurt her while he was in their small apartment. After years of ongoing abuse and one particularly violent incident, he and his mother left their apartment and sought refuge at a women's shelter. AJ described the shelter as the first time in his life that his family received support for IPV. He described the shelter staff as nice, but that the shelter lacked privacy, and he felt confused because no one explained why he was there or what would happen next. While at the shelter, AJ was unable to attend school. Shelter staff assisted AJ's mother in finding a new apartment. The new apartment, however, was in a different area of the city, and he was unable to continue attending his previous school. AJ shared with us that he lost his friends and he did not have any adult support at his new school because no one knew what he had experienced. AJ explained that he began to act out because he never received support to deal with the trauma he experienced from witnessing IPV. His mother became unable to care for him anymore, and AJ became a child in care of CFS. He frequently moved between foster homes and school systems and describes adults and other professionals in his life as not recognizing, quote, the real reason why I was having problems. They tried to do it the easiest way. They wanted to manage me, not find out why I was acting up, end quote. It wasn't until AJ's mental health challenges escalated enough to receive intensive mental health treatment that he began to get the support he needed to process his adverse childhood experiences. AJ had many ideas of how to improve the lives of children like him who are currently experiencing IPV. He also gave the following, he also gave the following advice for children and youth who are currently in a situation similar to his growing up. He says, things will get better. Use what you know from these events and apply it in life in a good way, end quote. So intimate partner violence, or IPV, is the physical, sexual, emotional, financial, and/or psychological violence or coercion between current or former intimate partners. IPV can be perpetrated in person or electronically, for example, through social media. But underlying such violence is the attempt to systematically control an intimate partner. IPV can occur in all types of intimate relationships, regardless of the gender and sexual orientation of the partners. IPV occurs in every community, regardless of age, religion, economic status, ethnicity, or educational attainment. Yet some groups of people that have been historically oppressed, including Indigenous women, are more at risk than others. Although no single definition exists, most experts agree that children are exposed to or can be said to have witnessed IPV when they are aware of adults' violence towards each other. Such awareness can take many different forms and can include children seeing evidence of abuse, for example, bruises on a parent's body, witnessing physical aggression or incidents of violence, hearing threats or violent altercations, witnessing police intervention, hearing stories about the violence, or being part of the violence, for example, by coercion or force, intervening, or being assaulted. The impact of IPV on children who witness it can vary. In some cases, short and long-term impacts may be minimal. In others, they can be extreme. This depends on the contextual and individual protective factors, including the child's age, developmental stage, gender, community involvement, relationship with the perpetrator and victim, as well as the number and type of other risk factors to which the child is exposed. Despite individual differences, there is consensus and ample evidence that exposure to IPV can negatively affect the health and development of children and youth. For example, witnessing IPV in childhood has been associated with mental health issues in adolescence and adulthood, including symptoms of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Children who are exposed to IPV may have poorer school performance, more days missed in school, a greater likelihood of criminal involvement, and a greater likelihood of dropping out. Studies have also shown that they are more likely to attempt death by suicide and to use drugs and alcohol. So the impact of IPV can span generations. Children who have witnessed violence in childhood are more likely to become adults who engage in violent behavior, both inside and outside of the home. Exposure to IPV against the mother is one of the most common factors associated with male perpetration of violence and female experience of violence later in life. This intergenerational transmission of IPV must be understood within the framework of historical oppression, colonialism, and the ongoing oppression of women, Indigenous peoples, and marginalized groups. The experience of witnessing IPV in childhood is pervasive among the children and youth and young adults served by the Office of the Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth, or MACY. For example, in the 2020-2021 fiscal year, nearly 1 out of every 5 children and youth and young adults supported through our advocacy services program had a history of IPV. Further, 53% of all child and young adult death reviews completed by our office in that same year have documented IPV in the childhood of the deceased. Unfortunately, although childhood exposure to IPV remains an all too common systemic issue identified by our office, little information exists about the nature and extent of the problem in Manitoba specifically. Improving services for children and youth requires an increased understanding of both the extent of children's exposure to IPV and the governmental response to children and youth exposed to IPV. Importantly, understanding the extent, nature, and services associated with witnessing IPV can point towards ways to break the cycle of intergenerational violence for families and for communities. As a result, the Manitoba Advocate directed the launch and release of a special report with 3 main questions in mind. 1, what is the nature and extent of children and youth witnessing IPV in Manitoba? 2, what are the perspectives and lived experiences of young people who witnessed IPV in childhood? And 3, what is the government of Manitoba's legal and service response to children exposed to IPV, and how can the provincial government meet its obligations to children exposed to IPV under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the UNCRC? In order to answer the research questions, the special report uses both qualitative and quantitative methods, including analysis of administrative data and documents, interviews with young adults with lived experience of witnessing IPV, and interviews with service providers and system experts to understand the experiences of children exposed to IPV in Manitoba. So as you can see here, we followed 3 main steps. First, we reviewed every police reported incident of intimate partner violence in Manitoba in April 2019. Every police force in Manitoba participated, including the RCMP and municipal police forces across the province. From those, we identified the incidents where children were noted to be present in the residence. This helped us understand the extent of the issue and also describe the children exposed to IPV. But we didn't stop there. We wanted to know what was the service response to the children exposed to IPV. So we linked the police information with the administrative databases at victim services and child welfare services to track over time what happened. For those of you here who are researchers, this was a retrospective cohort study. So to triangulate or to verify the information we collected, we also conducted consultations and interviews with the Youth Ambassador Advisory Squad here at MACY, and conducted in-depth interviews with young adults who witnessed IPV in their childhood. Finally, and to inform recommendations, we also had interviews with 25 service providers and system experts from Manitoba and engaged with the Elders Council as well as Indigenous governments. This is one of the strengths of this report, which is based not only in the data we found, but also in the experiential voices and perspectives of young people and service providers. Throughout the development of the report, the knowledge keeper at MACY, who we already met, Cheryl, she participated in project meetings, providing essential guidance to the team, as well as ensuring cultural, spiritual, and therapeutic supports for young participants before, during, and after the interviews. Before we go any further, you might be wondering why we chose to examine data only from the month of April 2019. So the special report originally intended to be a 1-year retrospective study of all IPV cases in 2019, so the last full pre-COVID year. Unfortunately, the volume of cases was too large and would have required too many resources from police and our office to review. So out of necessity, the scope of the period was reduced to cases from a single month in 2019. After consulting with experts in the field about the relationship between IPV and seasonality, we ultimately chose the month of April as an average or representative month, one in which known stressors like Warm weather, financial stress, holidays, important sporting events would likely not be a major factor. Still, we believe the snapshot of children exposed to IPV in the month of April 2019 will serve as a useful tool to help us understand the extent of the problem and bring us closer to both narrowing the service gaps in Manitoba and preventing harm to children and youth in our province. So as I mentioned already, exposure to intimate partner violence in childhood can be deeply traumatic for young people, shattering feelings of safety, leading to lifelong mental health challenges, and sometimes reinforcing cycles of intergenerational violence. So this webinar and the special report aim to shine a light on a hidden epidemic: children exposed to intimate partner violence in Manitoba, their experiences, and service responses. So by the end of this webinar, I hope you will take away the 5 key facts everyone should know about children and youth exposed to IPV in Manitoba, and how together, as Manitobans, we can ensure we listen to the voices of young people that have gone unheard for far too long. Finally, we will be sharing numbers and data about children and youth who were exposed to a police-reported incident of intimate partner violence. But I wanted to take a moment to remind everyone and acknowledge that every number you see, every graph, every stat tells the story of a family that is being traumatized by violence. As advocates for children, we are honored to be entrusted with the important responsibility of telling and sharing their stories. I will now pass things over to my colleague, Charlene.
Thanks, Matt. The first fact that we want you to know is that exposure to IPV is a children's rights issue. As an organization, everything we do at MACY, from direct advocacy to research, is grounded in children's rights. Our work is informed by both a human rights and a child's rights approach. Taking a children's rights approach is essential because all children, including infants, are rights holders, and therefore governments have corresponding duties to them as articulated in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, also known as the UNCRC. When Canada ratified the UNCRC, our provincial and federal governments agreed to be held to those responsibilities. Children and youth in Manitoba have the right to be protected from physical and psychological violence, abuse, and neglect. And our governments have a corresponding obligation to take the appropriate legislative, administrative, and educational measures to protect children from such maltreatment, as stated in Article 19 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. It is also the responsibility of governments to enact preventative measures to ensure that all children traumatized by violence receive the support and assistance they require to recover their health, dignity, self-respect, and social life, as per Article 39 of the UNCRC. Also, as articulated by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, as well as the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, intimate partner violence and the cycles of family violence have their roots in historical and ongoing colonial legacies. Violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2SL LGBTQ+ people is rooted in colonial policies that removed women from their traditional roles in communities and diminished their status, thus leaving them vulnerable to violence. Indigenous women, girls, and 2SL LGBTQ+ people are holders of distinctive First Nations, MACY, and Inuit rights. And these rights, along with human rights, have been consistently denied as a result of their relationships with the state. This special report reflects on the rights of the children in this context of the ongoing journey of reconciliation and decolonization. Before I share the second fact, we wanted to take a quick poll to gauge people's estimates as to the scope of the problem of intimate partner violence in Manitoba. The poll question should be appearing on your screen right away. Approximately how many incidents of intimate partner violence were reported to police across Manitoba in the month of April 2019? If you guys could answer, we'll give you a minute to do so. Looks like a few more people still have to respond. We'll give another few seconds. Okay, I think we'll close the poll. The correct answer is 4. So in April 2019 alone, so we're looking at just 30 days, there were nearly 2,000 police reported cases of IPV in Manitoba. This number helps illustrate the second fact I would like you to know. The second fact then is that exposure to IPV is not only a children's rights issue, but also a very serious social and public health issue in Manitoba. Information was requested and received from the First Nations Police Service, the RCMP, as well as the municipal police services of Altona, Brandon, Morden, Rivers, St. Anne, Winkler, and Winnipeg. As alluded to in our poll, in total, there were 1,943 police reported cases of intimate partner violence during that 1-month period of April 2019 across Manitoba. Provincial police services review these nearly 2,000 cases from which they identified 342 intimate partner violence cases, or nearly 1 in 5, in which children were documented to be present or had witnessed the incident. Over this 1-month period in Manitoba, this translates into 1 police reported IPV incident witnessed by a child every 2 hours. Keep in mind, however, that this is almost certainly an underestimate, since it is based on police reported incidents only, and we know that many more, or perhaps most IPV incidents often go unreported to police. The numbers we show you here are the first time that this has been calculated in Manitoba, and indicate that exposure to IPV is a significant social issue of concern for children in Manitoba. Indeed, as mentioned, each of these incidents represents the story of a family that is being traumatized by violence. We found that collectively, over this 1-month period, 671 unique children were identified as being present during or having been directly exposed to an intimate partner violence incident in these 342 cases identified by provincial police services. We also found that 6% of children, or 42 children, were exposed to more than 1 incident of IPV that month, with some experiencing up to 4 incidents in the month of April 2019, or 1 police reported IPV incident a week. When counting these children who were exposed to more than 1 IPV incident in April 2019, the total number of police interactions with unique children in April 2019 rises to 721. What these numbers really enforce is our second key takeaway, that exposure to IPV is way too common in Manitoba. Research is clear that this type of unresolved trauma can lead to a host of issues, including depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. As mentioned, it also increases the likelihood of those children who have poor school performance, more missed days at school, and a greater likelihood of dropping out of school altogether. Exposure to IPV also increases the potential for the child to become involved with the justice system, or to grow and to engage in violent behavior both inside and outside their homes. A review of the police files showed that the average or mean age of the children exposed to IPV in April 2019 was 5.8 years old, and that 93% of all children exposed to IPV were under 6 years of age. The finding that younger children are overrepresented in cases involving exposure to IPV is consistent with other studies, and also may reflect the fact that IPV prevalence is highest among younger couples, those aged between 18 to 24 years of age, compared to other age cohorts. In other words, younger parents are more likely to have younger children, and couples with young children also experience higher levels of stress than couples with no children or older children. This also would reflect that older children and youth have the ability to leave the home and may be at home less. Despite this issue being prevalent, not all cases are reported to police result in charges. Of the 342 IPV cases in which children were present, less than half, or 48%, saw criminal charges laid against one or both of the intimate partners. And the remaining 178, or 52% of police reported cases, no criminal charges were filed as a result of the IPV incident in question. Some of the reasons charges were not laid included that the incident did not reach the threshold of a crime, that the adult victim did not want to testify, the Crown did not bring the case forward, or there was a general lack of evidence. The types of charges laid against the accused varied based on the severity of the incident and the criminal history of the accused. Of the incidents resulting in charges, 84% had 2 or more charges laid, which accounts for a total of 446 charges. Sometimes the children themselves called police to address the violence they were witnessing, and when the offending caregiver was removed from the house and later returned. The third fact we would like you to know is that exposure to IPV in childhood is a serious equity issue in Manitoba. We found that Indigenous children are overrepresented among the group of children exposed to IPV. Where ancestry was known, 81%, or 497 children, were Indigenous, including 463 First Nations children, or 76%, 29 Métis, 5%, and 5 Inuit children, 1%. The remaining 113 children who were exposed to IPV in April 2019 were non-Indigenous. The overrepresentation of Indigenous children experiencing IPV in Manitoba is an ongoing legacy of the colonial violence inflicted upon Indigenous women and families through state policies such as residential schools, the 60 Scoop, and the Millennium Scoop through child welfare. Historical trauma and violent oppression contribute to the increased risk for Indigenous women and their children to experience violence from intimate partners and from other perpetrators. Breaking the cycle of violence by responding early to childhood trauma is essential for healing, for breaking the cycle of intergenerational violence, and for the fulfillment of every child's right to thrive and recover from their trauma, as per Article 39 of the UNCRC. A majority of the young adults we interviewed indicated that IPV was also intergenerational in their families. 75% of young adults specifically talked about their caregivers witnessing IPV themselves as children. And this is tied with experiences of relatives in residential schools for First Nations participants. In the words of Louise, a young adult with lived experience of IPV as a child, I quote, "I remember my mom telling me that my grandma always got abuse from my grandpa and that she would see that. They were both in residential school too," end quote. 2 young adults we interviewed also experienced IPV themselves inside their intimate relationships as teenagers or adults, further illustrating the often cyclical and intergenerational nature of IPV. The files reviewed also reflect dimensions of gender-based inequities. Where known, the vast majority or 85% of adult survivors of police reported IPV from April 2019, in which children were present, were female, and only 15% were male. Furthermore, the majority were 84% of the accused perpetrators of police reported IPV in which children were present were male. This finding is consistent with studies across Canada and the world, which identify intimate partner violence as the most common form of violence against women, a major public health problem and a violation of women's human rights indeed. The types of violence incidents were different depending on the victim's gender. As you can see in this graph here, adult female survivors were more likely than adult male survivors to experience physical or sexual violence, while adult male survivors were more likely to experience psychological violence. Many studies and elders speak of how the ongoing legacy of colonialism has introduced a system where men hold power and women are excluded from power, and has become a key factor in this generation gender-based violence. We also saw inequities and disparities in the likelihood of being exposed to intimate partner violence and residents in northern communities in Manitoba. We found that the majority of children exposed to IPV in Manitoba did live in Winnipeg, 71%, but children residing within the Northern Regional Health Authority were more likely to be exposed to IPV in April 2019 compared to all other regional health authorities at a rate of 34 per 10,000 children and youth. Some studies have found that increased isolation experienced by residents of rural, northern, and geographically isolated communities may lead to increased vulnerabilities. Studies on geographic disparities speak to the long-term impacts of forced relocations and the loss and exploitation of Indigenous land, which led to the diminished access to resources, both in economic and social areas, and impacted familial and kinship ties in ways that contribute to intimate partner violence. In short, IPV in Manitoba is rooted in fundamental social and economic inequalities, resulting from these ongoing legacies of colonialization that contribute to the overrepresentation of Indigenous women and children exposed to intimate partner violence in this province. These findings really do point us to the need to recognize the effects of ongoing colonialism and to highlight the important work of Indigenous women and communities that, through cultural resurgence, are leading change centered on the principles of self-determination. The fourth fact that everyone should know about children and youth exposed to intimate partner violence in Manitoba is that there's an enormous gap in the service response available to children exposed to IPV in our province. The special report followed a group of 671 Manitoba children with 721 total police reported IPV exposures during the month of April 2019. We looked at these 721 interactions over time to understand their contact with public systems and the service responses from police, victim services, and child and family services. First, we identified if, after contact with police, there was a referral to services such as CFS or victim services. Then we looked at whether there was some sort of assessment. And finally, we reviewed the service response. What we found, unfortunately, is very deeply concerning. We found that 258 children, or 36%, did not receive a referral to either victim services or child welfare following contact with police. This is shown in orange in the top left corner of the slide shown. The remainder of the children received referrals to victim services, child welfare, or both. And this is shown in purple or blue on the bottom column in the figure. Following the cohort of 348 children who received victim services referrals, Out of those children, only 8 or 2% received direct services from victim services. And these services were in the form of court preparation in advance of them being a witness for the Crown. And only 1 of these 8 children was documented to have received funding for mental health services, although we were unable to find evidence that the approved funding was actually used. As one service provider we spoke with put it, quote, "Victim services is really Crown services. Their role is so limited," end quote. What we found is that the weight of responding to children and families is primarily held by child welfare services, but that is not necessarily the most appropriate service stream for them. Of the children referred to child welfare, 34% received some sort of an assessment from CFS, and ultimately 95% received a service response of some type. Yet, when we looked at the response, it was not typically aimed at the children themselves, but mainly focused on the adult survivor and sometimes the adult perpetrator. Children rarely receive direct supports, including therapeutic supports from child welfare to process their trauma. We found that a total of 18 children, or 6% of children referred to CFS, were apprehended following an incident of intimate violent IPV exposure in April 2019. A review of these apprehensions found that the majority were short-term. The low number of apprehensions suggests that while many survivors are fearful of child apprehensions due to reporting IPV incidents, that it was not a common response from child welfare. So, what do all of these numbers, as well as the interviews with service providers and young adults, tell us? First, the majority of children did not receive any service response despite interacting with police or other service providers. Our overall finding in orange is that 416 children, or 58%, who were known to be exposed to IPV that month, there was no documented service response from either victim services or child welfare. Second, the role of victim services in responding to children is limited. Children are only considered at the center of service provision when they are witnesses for the Crown in court proceedings, and it is only then that we found any service response. Third, the primary service response to children who witness IPV in Manitoba comes from child welfare in the form of direct services or sometimes referrals. However, a review of the types of services and referrals indicates that they are largely adult-centric, focusing on the adult survivor. These results reflect experiences by young adults who were exposed to IPV in their childhood, as well as the perspectives of service providers and community-based organizations. Young people we spoke to described the feeling of invisibility and confusion when interacting with services and of struggling in silence for many years with the trauma of their experiences. Many discuss how they did not receive the supports they needed until adulthood. In the words of AJ, I quote, "Nobody followed up. I supported myself," end quote. What we saw in the data is that service responders were focused on immediate safety from police, criminal prosecution from victim services, and immediate child protection from child welfare, which are the mandates of these systems involved. Yet, many children fell outside of the mandates because they were exposed to incidents that not lead to charges, or there was no immediate protection concerns. None of these systems, even when a response was recorded, were currently able to offer direct therapeutic or long-term response to children and their families experiencing IPV. When we asked young people what would have helped them, they said that more service providers to have direct communication with them, that they would like immediate and long-term therapeutic supports, like someone to talk to after police attended their house that can check in with them, all the children at the house, a 24/7 texting call line or app to get support and information, They would like more information about healthy relationships in schools and more training for teachers to identify and support children who witness IPV at home. We also conducted 25 semi-structured interviews with service providers that work with children and families affected by IPV. They were asked to share what they have learned working with children and youth who have experienced IPV and the impact of such exposure has had on the lives of these young people. The interviews with community organization workers who gifted us with their wisdom and knowledge revealed key gaps and challenges faced by children in Manitoba who witness IPV. Problematically, while the psychosocial and emotional impacts for children exposed to IPV are significant, again, they are not perceived as victims entitled to supports. Several community organization workers also emphasize the issue of intergenerational trauma. In the words of one worker, quote, "We're seeing the generations. We are seeing the names. I'm seeing the names of boys that I met here as children now listed as the abuser. And I'm seeing the names of girls and seeing them in a shelter. It's a perpetuating cycle of violence. There has to be some type of intervention, a point of intervention to break this," end quote. In addition, service providers spoke about the need for more services with an emphasis on Indigenous-led wraparound supports, services like victim services, CFS, and police, and their need to work to build trust in the community. That meeting gaps such as supports for men, both perpetrators and victims, as well as newcomers were important. And that providers also identified the gap in response and need to address it to prevent and break the cycles of violence. One message that was consistent across all interviews was that children exposed to intimate partner violence were not seen as primary victims of IPV by the systems currently asked to respond to this issue. Because children are unseen, neither their needs nor their rights are being met. Ultimately, the report found that children exposed to IPV in Manitoba feel invisible and disempowered when they are in contact with services. The current response to their needs falls short of fulfilling their rights to treatment and recovery as enshrined by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Truly, there is a need to reimagine a response to children exposed to intimate partner violence in Manitoba that is coordinated and addresses the intergenerational cycles of violence. Now, I would like to pass things over to my colleague, Ali Raza.
Thank you, Charlene. As mentioned, there is a need to reimagine a response to children exposed to intimate partner violence that is coordinated and addresses the intergenerational cycles of violence. Overall, the report has a message of hope. Accordingly, the fifth and final fact everyone should know about children and youth exposed to intimate partner violence in Manitoba is that IPV exposures can be broken. To this end, the Manitoba Advocate has issued 7 recommendations to the Government of Manitoba with the goal of increasing the responsiveness and effectiveness of services for children and youth exposed to IPV in this province. Children and youth are rights holders, as recognized by the international agreement, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or UNCRC, and are thus entitled to the highest standards of care and special supports, as per Articles 24 and 39 of the UNCRC, and protection from all forms of violence, as per Article 19 of the UNCRC. Governments and service providers have the responsibility as duty bearers to ensure children's rights are respected and realized through the provision of child-centered services that ensure the best interests of the child are prioritized, as per Article 3 of the UNCRC. Thus, informed by a comprehensive review of the data, in-depth interviews with young people with lived experience, and consultations with youth, community workers, system experts, public bodies, elders, and First Nations and MACY government representatives, the Manitoba Advocate has issued 7 recommendations, which will provide the public bodies with a roadmap to reposition children as centrally impacted by IPV, to increase IPV service navigation so that it is child-centered, to improve systems coordination and integration to address gender-based violence across multiple departments and service areas, and finally, to increase awareness and education about IPV, its effects on children who are exposed to it, and healthy relationships to break the cycles of violence. While the full and detailed recommendations are available in the report and our website, what follows are the main outlines or summary of the 7 recommendations for system change issued by our office to government bodies. Young adults who were exposed to intimate partner violence in their own childhoods spoke to us about feeling invisible and confused when interacting with services, and of struggling in silence for many years with the trauma of their experiences. Many discussed how they did not receive the supports they needed until they sought them out themselves in adulthood. By then, some of them had personally experienced IPV in their own relationships, a continuation of the persistent cycle of violence. Those young adults called on public services to do more to recognize and support child victims in their immediate response, but also in the overall approach to preventing intimate partner violence. Indeed, service providers, system experts, and young adults with lived experience who were interviewed for this report frequently noted that too often children exposed to IPV are not perceived as victims. Data analysis confirms that the majority of children exposed to IPV did not receive a service response, and when delivered, the service response was aimed at the adult victim and/or the accused. Recognizing the rights of children and their entitlements is an essential first step to the provision of child-centered care. The first recommendation, therefore, calls for the recognition of children as primary victims of IPV and rights holders entitled to support under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. As stated, as many as 36% of children exposed to IPV that came into contact with police did not receive a referral to follow-up services. The likelihood of a referral was dependent on where the child resides and the policies of that police service. Young people interviewed explained the need for trauma-informed and child-centered immediate responses to address the needs of children and to connect them to longer-term services. Pilot programs exist that better integrate police with social service specialists that can build trust and provide trauma-informed responses. The second recommendation, therefore, calls for enhancing the immediate response to children exposed to IPV through the development of a police service standards framework. In 2021, a promising pilot project was initiated by Victim Services and the Winnipeg Police Service, or WPS, through which 3 victim services staff respond together to non-urgent IPV incidents. WPS and Manitoba Justice launched this pilot project based on calls in the community to provide a multi-agency response. WPS reported that this has decreased the need to send uniformed police officers to attend the home, and it has also increased immediate access to social services for families. While this is a promising response with potential, it has not been evaluated and might not be suitable to all communities. This is why, through a consultation process, that elicits feedback from Indigenous-led community agencies and the families impacted by the program, the Manitoba Advocate recommended that the Minister of Justice conduct an independent outcome evaluation of the Winnipeg Police Service and Manitoba Justice's Domestic Violence Support Service pilot program that provides an integrated response to incidents of IPV, and then to make the results of that evaluation available to the public. We found that no single government department holds the responsibility to assist and support children exposed to IPV. Current mandates limit service responses for the majority of children exposed to IPV. Most cases did not present immediate child protection concerns, yet the majority of service responses were led by Child and Family Services, meaning there is a mismatch between a family's need and what the established provincial services are mandated to provide. The fourth recommendation thus calls for establishing a centralized and coordinate response with the goal of closing gaps and supporting families and children exposed to IPV through culturally appropriate and trauma-informed approaches. The fourth objective is to develop therapeutic supports for children exposed to IPV. Even if children were identified, they rarely received direct services to address their trauma. We found that documented service responses from child welfare and referrals to services were for adult-centric therapeutic supports. Community service providers and domestic violence shelters identified a gap in specialized services for children, resulting in a gap in the response to children's trauma and associated behavioral and mental health needs. This leaves the response in our province inconsistent with the UNCRC and not meeting the principles and goals of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry to address the intergenerational cycles of violence. Accordingly, recommendation number 5 calls for the development of a specialized response to support a continuum of culturally appropriate and clinical services available to children and youth exposed to IPV in Manitoba. And then in recommendation 6, consistent with the aims and objectives of family violence shelters, the advocate recommends enhancing funding to each of the 10 family violence shelters in Manitoba to ensure employment of a child-focused trauma specialist, which under current funding agreements is difficult for shelters to do. The final objective is to promote healthy relationships in schools. Young people and service providers spoke about the normalization of violence in their lives and the need to inform children and families about the impacts of violence as well as the resources available to them. Children growing up around IPV must be given the opportunity to learn about healthy relationships to better understand that such violence is not normal and what they are experiencing is not their fault. While healthy relationships are included in the Manitoba curriculum, teachers, school clinicians, and other school staff need to be empowered to teach and talk about healthy relationships and the effects of IPV on children and youth. Thus, the final recommendation issued in the report calls on Manitoba Education to provide tools and supports to teachers so they can empower young people with information on healthy relationships through the development of guides and resources. So, to recap the 5 facts everyone should know about children's exposure to IPV in Manitoba. Number 1, exposure to IPV in childhood is a child's rights issue. Children and youth in Manitoba have the right to be protected from physical and psychological violence, abuse, and neglect. governments have a corresponding obligation to take appropriate legislative, administrative, social, and educational measures to protect children from such maltreatment, as per Article 19 of the UNCRC. It is also the responsibility of government to enact preventative measures and ensure that all children traumatized by violence receive the support and assistance they require to recover their health, dignity, self-respect, and social life, as per Article 39 of the UNCRC. Fact number 2. Exposure to IPV in childhood is a serious social issue in Manitoba. Once every 2 hours, a child in Manitoba is exposed to a police-reported incident of intimate partner violence. IPV is a serious concern in Manitoba. In the month of April 2019 alone, there were 1,943 police-reported incidents of intimate partner violence across all police forces in our province, of which 342 involved a total of 671 unique children. Each of those incidents represents the story of a child and a family that is being traumatized by violence. Fact number 3. Exposure to IPV in childhood is a serious equity issue in Manitoba. The vast majority of children exposed to IPV are Indigenous, with 76% First Nation, 5% Métis, and 1% Inuit ancestry. As articulated by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, IPV and the cycles of family violence have their roots in historical and ongoing colonial legacies. This violence is rooted in colonial policies that removed women from their traditional roles in communities and diminished their status, leaving them vulnerable to violence. Fact number 4, there is an enormous gap in the service response available to children exposed to intimate partner violence in Manitoba. Each system is fulfilling their limited mandate, with police responding to immediate danger, victim services providing court-focused supports when criminal charges are laid, and child welfare responding when immediate protection issues exist. Yet, most children being traumatized by violence in the home fall outside of those limited service mandates, and thus receive no information or therapeutic supports to recover from their trauma, as is their right under Article 39 of the UNCRC. Yet, ultimately, there is a message of hope. Fact number 5, the intergenerational cycles of violence can be broken by addressing the system's systemic gaps. In response to these troubling findings, the Manitoba Advocate has issued 7 recommendations which provide the Government of Manitoba with an opportunity to respond in innovative ways to not only realize the rights of children, but also contribute to an end to the cycles of intergenerational violence by addressing the trauma crisis in our province. I'll now pass things back to Matt.
Thanks, Ali. So this special report then, as you heard, the first of its kind, reviewing services for children exposed to IPV in Manitoba, outlines the enormous scope of the problem and important service gaps in the area of immediate supports, service navigation, specialized therapeutic responses, and education. The recommendations included describe a pathway that could transform the collective response to children who are exposed to IPV and offer a way towards addressing intergenerational cycles of violence. It is our collective responsibility as Manitobans to ensure we listen to the voices of young people that have gone unheard for far too long. If you're interested in reading the full report and the accompanying informational video, the links will be posted very shortly in the chat. Thank you. I'll just pass things back to Carly to close up.
Thank you very much, Matt, Charlene, and Ali, and to all of you, the service providers, community organizations, community members, government representatives, young adults, IPV survivors, system experts, and university students in attendance. We now have some time for questions. So you can either use the raise hand function on Zoom to let us know that you have a question, and then we'll invite you to voice it aloud, or you can type out your question using the Zoom question panel below or the chat box. So I'm not seeing any hands or questions. So we'll just give folks a minute here, and I want to thank the team for being so comprehensive. All right, well, on behalf of the Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth, thank you so much for attending our webinar today. Our contact information is now on the screen, and I want to remind everyone to please fill out the short evaluation, which you can now find in the chat, so we can continuously improve our webinars. And again, all participants who are able to complete that, we will send you a certificate. And we will have the recording of today's webinar up on our YouTube page soon, and we invite you to share that with others. And so it's now my honor and pleasure to welcome back Knowledge Keeper Cheryl Alexander, who is going to honor the learning that has taken place here in a good way with a closing prayer.
Thank you. Miigwech ni mashumas oji basawe aziyang. Miigwech na kit nom gom gagi jigat. Webane jimano gana wabamang. Niwi jimano bamatis minawa webane jigaganon. Miigwech gaish gashkami akwe. Oji miziyang mamatiziowen minawa majim. Oji miziyang nabish minawa wesieg. Oji miziyang nesawin. Sema debaganina wabano jawano eshbamang. Minawa gewetanon. Nada motion G mashko gaya wianan. Minawa G zungia dayan. Miigwech kichimanatu aho.
Miigwech, thank you very much, Cheryl, and good afternoon, everyone.